Boston, 1946. The city was rebuilding itself brick by brick, breath by breath, yet behind the new storefronts and polished sidewalks, shadows still lingered. Shadows of a world broken by war, of lives paused mid-sentence, of families that never quite found their way back. Edward Miller walked the narrow streets of South Boston with a quiet rhythm, as if he were trying not to wake something that still slept beneath the rubble. He had returned from Europe a year ago, his uniform folded away in a cedar box, his medals untouched, and the war still echoing in the bones of his silence. 3 years earlier, in 1943, his wife Eleanor had died during an air raid in London, where she'd gone to be closer to his station. At the time, she was pregnant with their first child. News came in pieces: a letter from a nurse, a friend's memory, a telegram too short to explain anything. No body was recovered, no record of a baby, just an ocean of grief and an unopened letter Edward had written to her weeks before the attack. That letter still lived in the inside pocket of his wool coat. He read it sometimes, late at night, not for the words, but for the weight. During the days, Edward volunteered with local charities and reconstruction projects, repairing homes and assisting in shelters. It wasn't purpose that drove him. It was the absence of one. On a rainy Wednesday in March, he arrived at a church-run orphanage near Dorchester, carrying lumber for a broken stairwell. The old building smelled of damp wood and chalk, its hallways echoing with the soft murmur of children who had lost too much too soon. And then it happened. A child's voice, uncertain but clear, called out, "Dad!" He turned slowly. At the end of the hallway stood a little girl, maybe 5 years old, barefoot, with tangled dark hair and eyes too serious for her age. Around her neck, hanging from a frayed string, was a silver locket, old, simple, engraved with the initials EM. Edward froze. A nun approached quietly and spoke in a hushed voice. She was found alone outside Worcester in late 1944. No records, no family. She never spoke. We named her Lucy. Edward knelt down, meeting the girl's gaze. Something in her face, not just resemblance but recognition, stirred a part of him that had long forgotten how to feel. In a country healing from war, among ruins both visible and invisible, that one word, Dad, was enough to make everything change. If this story touched you the way it touched me writing it, please like and subscribe. Your support helps us share more true stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what happens next changes everything. When Edward Miller returned to the orphanage the following morning, the winter air still damp with last night's rain, and the city of Boston humming with the weary routine of reconstruction, he wasn't driven by duty or by the promise of completing any repairs, but by a stirring he hadn't felt in years, something fragile and inexplicably alive, awakened by the voice of a child who, with a single W, or spoken in a dusty hallway, had pulled him out of the silence he had wrapped around himself like a second skin. She was seated by the far window, perched on a low wooden bench, her knees drawn up under a woolen dress that hung too loose on her small frame, and with a pencil dull from overuse gripped tightly in her hand, she moved across a torn page as though each stroke carried the weight of something remembered, something too delicate to name. And Edward, standing for a moment in the doorway, saw in her stillness a quiet that mirrored his own, the kind of silence born not of peace, but of waiting. He walked toward her slowly, each step measured not out of fear, but reverence. The way a man might approach a painting he once saw in a museum during shore leave, something that moved him deeply, but that he didn't understand. And as he reached her side, she didn't look up, but he noticed how her shoulders settled ever so slightly, as if acknowledging his presence not through sight or sound, but through the kind of awareness that exists between people long before they speak. When he finally sat beside her, he didn't offer words, only stillness, and looked at what she was drawing. A house with a slanted roof, a woman with long hair, a man in a coat, and a child between them, holding both hands. The lines crude and uneven, but unmistakably purposeful, and in that image, Edward felt the first tremor of something that wasn't quite recognition, but carried its weight. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed his locket, the silver one with the worn clasp, and the initials EM, engraved on the back, on the table beside hers, and when she saw it, her fingers moved instinctively to the matching one that hung around her neck on a piece of old thread, as if something in her memory had just taken shape, something too old for words, yet too real to ignore. Sister Margaret, the same nun who had spoken to him the day before, approached with the care of someone who had learned long ago that true stories are never told loudly, and in a voice that barely rose above the creaking floorboards, she explained that the girl, whom they had named Lucy, had been found near Worcester in late 1944, alone, dirty, silent, and that not once had she spoken a word to her, till the previous day when she called him Dad. Edward said nothing in response, only watched as Lucy continued to draw, now adding a small garden beside the house. And though his mind searched for logic, for clarity, for timelines that matched or failed to match, his heart moved ahead of him, faster than caution, faster than fear, to a place he hadn't dared enter since Eleanor's death, a place where he was still a father, where something of her still remained. In the days that followed, he returned again and again, sometimes with nothing more than an apple in his coat pocket or a carved wooden toy he shaped late at night when sleep refused to come, and sometimes with only his presence, which, as he came to understand, was all Lucy needed to begin meeting his eyes, to start sitting a little closer, to one day offer him a folded piece of paper with a doctor, awing of the two of them walking side by side under a sky drawn with bold, thick strokes of blue. Boston, in those years, was a city that carried its pain in silence, where children like Lucy fell through the cracks of bureaucracies overwhelmed by the aftermath of war, where names were lost, records incomplete, and stories passed from one shelter to another like fading smoke. And Edward, knowing this, searched anyway, through parish records, hospital logs, Red Cross notes, and the vague memories of people who had once known Eleanor, hoping for something more than coincidence, hoping for a sliver of truth that would tether Lucy's life to his. What he found was not certainty, but clues. A nurse who remembered a woman, heavily pregnant in London, looking for her husband. A letter never delivered. A hospital that had burned in the Blitz. And through all of it, Edward carried that locket in his palm like a compass, not pointing him toward facts, but toward a feeling, the kind he had long since taught himself to ignore. Then one afternoon, as a soft snow began to fall and the world outside the orphanage was wrapped in a kind of quiet only winter can bring, Lucy turned to him and asked, not loudly but with clarity, "Do you remember the garden?" He looked at her, startled. The garden behind the flat in London, the one Eleanor tended with stubborn pride. He had written about it in his letter. The letter in his coat. He took a breath, slow and careful, and asked in return, "Did your mother have a soft voice?" Lucy nodded and returned to her drawing. He did not know what she truly remembered, but he knew what he believed, and sometimes belief, born from grief and nurtured in silence, is the only truth we're given. There are memories so embedded in silence that they only surface when something or someone touches the exact place where grief sleeps. Not with noise, not with words, but with presence. And that's exactly what Lucy was beginning to do. Not by asking questions or making demands, but simply by being there, morning after morning, with her small drawings and her quiet gaze, reminding Edward Miller of a time when he had believed in beginnings, in promises, in the kind of love that grows between people even when the world around them is falling apart. He started dreaming again, not in images but in sensations. The smell of Eleanor's lavender soap in the mornings, the warmth of her breath against his shoulder, the way her voice softened when she spoke about the future, especially the baby, their baby. The one she had hoped would inherit his eyes, but her steadiness, a child that, in letters exchanged across oceans and battle lines, they had long before it was born, Lucy. In one of those letters, dated September 1943, he had written, "When the war is over, I will walk through our door, and you'll hand her to me, and for the first time in years, I will breathe." But the war wasn't merciful. The air raid came before he could return. Eleanor had been staying near Russell Square in London, close to his command post in the months prior, hoping, as she wrote, to feel closer to you. And though he warned her of the danger, her stubbornness, the same quality that made him love her more fiercely than anyone before, had convinced her to stay. And on a night when the sky turned to fire and buildings split open like paper, her name vanished from every ledger, every hospital list, every registry. There had been rumors. Someone had seen a woman matching her description being carried from rubble. Another claimed she might have been taken to a makeshift clinic, but no confirmations, no details, only silence. The kind that roars in your ears when you realize you've lost more than a person. You've lost a future. When Edward returned to Boston in late 1945, his war wasn't over. It had simply changed terrain. He kept the letter, folded and refolded. He read it under dim lamps in empty rooms, always stopping at the last line, the line she never got to read. "If something happens, tell her I dreamed of her every night." And now here she was, or might be, sitting across from him with a locket around her neck and a voice that had broken its silence just to call him Dad. Some days he fought the urge to believe it. Other days he surrendered completely. He began visiting people from the old neighborhood who might have known Eleanor. Old friends, distant cousins, neighbors who remembered her as the girl with a laugh like wind chimes, the woman who kept clippings of his letters in a small box tied with blue ribbon, the expectant mother who had spoken of leaving for London just for a few weeks. He found a woman, Mrs. Adler, who had lived in the same boarding house years earlier and remembered that Eleanor, weeks before the attack, had mentioned feeling uneasy, had packed a small case, had written one last letter she never sent. Mrs. Adler didn't know where she went, only that she left in a hurry, pregnant, alone. It was possible, terrifyingly possible, that she had survived the blast, only to give birth in hiding, in transit, maybe in one of the overwhelmed hospitals where babies were registered under numbers, not names. And then, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of injury, she had slipped away, leaving the child in someone else's arms. That child might have worn the locket, Edward's parting gift sent from the front, and someone, not knowing what else to do, might have fastened it around the child's neck before placing her near a church, a shelter, a door. And then came Lucy. The nun at the orphanage confirmed that Lucy had arrived alone, brought by a soldier who never gave his name, a man who said little, only that he had found her in the ruins of a train station north of Worcester, and that she had clung to the locket as if it were a lifeline, refusing food until it was returned to her. Edward sat in that knowledge for hours, not certainty, but not chance either. In the quiet of his apartment, surrounded by unpacked boxes and shadows, he remembered one winter evening on the front lines, the ground frozen beneath their boots, smoke curling from distant barns, and a young German soldier cradling a child in his arms, refusing to leave the baby behind even as bullets snapped through the air. And Edward, watching this stranger cradle life in a place of death, had wondered, even then, what he would do if it were his own. Now he might have his answer. Still, he hesitated, because if he was wrong, if this hope he carried like a second heart turned out to be a mistake, he feared it would break him in ways war never could. He spoke with a doctor, had Lucy's blood type tested. It matched his. He traced hospital intake lists. Found a possible birth in January 1944. No name, no mother's record. It was all threads, frayed, incomplete. But when he returned to the orphanage that Friday afternoon, the snow still clinging to his shoulders, Lucy ran to him for the first time. No words, just arms wide, a drawing in her hand, a man holding a child, both surrounded by light. And something in him gave way, not in defeat, but in release. He bent down, took her face gently in his hands, and whispered the question he'd been too afraid to ask. "Lucy, would you like me to be your father?" She nodded and leaned into his chest. resting there, as if the question had never needed to be asked at all. Edward Miller realized that he could no longer drift in the grey realm between hope and doubt, because the more he watched Lucy settle into routines, arriving early at the orphanage, clutching new drawings, offering small smiles that glowed like fragile embers in a world still half cold, the more he felt that his responsibility lay not in unraveling every mystery, but in loving what stood clearly before him. Even without confirmation, even without proof, he began to trace threads he thought long lost. He searched through dusty case files at the Boston Children's Friends Society archives, reading registry pages in shaky handwriting and spotting mentions of unidentified children brought in late 1944 and early 1945, unnamed, often described only as found alone with necklace, and though paper records were sparse and many had been lost or burned during relocations, the pattern was there, a handful of entries referencing a child matching Lucy's age and the presence of a small locket. Next, he turned to interviews with former social workers, a retired nun who once managed the shelter near Worcester where Lucy was first found, and even a hospital clerk who remembered a woman brought in after an air raid in London, heavily pregnant, taken to a repurposed naval hospital in Boston. Though that woman's fate was unknown and no name was recorded, the memory kept returning to him. Eleanor's description, Lucy's birth date possibilities, the locket Edward had sent months before disaster struck, all aligning in ways he never wanted to believe but couldn't ignore. Outside Boston, he followed another trail. He traveled to the area outside Worcester, now scattered with boarded-up houses and ploughed fields, where a former train station had sheltered refugees in late 1944, and argued softly with a retired station master who, decades earlier, had seen a young soldier bring a silent, barefoot girl wearing a necklace, refusing food until the locket was returned. Details Aurora, the nun at the orphanage, had mentioned. And as he listened, witnessing the station master's hands trembling as he described the child's eyes, Edward felt something shift in his chest, as though time itself paused to let hope in. Returning to Boston, with nothing conclusive, he sought medical counsel. At that time, blood typing was the only accessible evidence of relation. He arranged for Lucy's blood type to be tested. In the United States, only about 8.5% of the population have B-positive blood, making it relatively rare, especially given Edward and Eleanor's own confirmed B-positive results. When the doctor told him Lucy also tested B-positive and that certain facial features, the shape of her eyes, the outline of her mouth, corresponded with childhood photos of Eleanor, Edward stood in the clinic, gripping his hat, feeling the silence echo louder than any certainty. He left without saying a word, walking home through streets strewn with reconstruction rubble, memories gnawing at him, of battlefield nights in Europe, of shell-shocked comrades, and of Eleanor's last letter, begging him to promise he'd come home to her, her voice telling him, "Carry her in your arms for me if I cannot," and he had promised, unaware he would lose everything. Now, after months of searching through archives, church records, hospital logs, and personal testimonies, he faced the weight of choice, not knowing for certain if Lucy was his daughter, but knowing that even if she wasn't, he still had a chance to give her something he'd withheld from himself, a name, a home, a voice calling him Dad. He wrestled with the fear, what if he was wrong? What if she was not his biological child, but someone else's lost daughter? Would loving her be dishonest? Might it hurt her more than the orphanage ever could? But then he recalled Lucy's drawing from the other day, a picture of a house with a garden of little flowers, a man holding a child's hand beneath a bright sun. And in her eyes, when she looked at him, there was that same silent understanding, the kind that doesn't ask permission, but quietly trusts. So, one late afternoon, Edward returned to the orphanage under soft light, filtering through frost-coated windows, carrying nothing but a carefully folded paper with a drawing. Two figures, an adult and a child, walking hand in hand toward a horizon drawn with hope. Lucy looked at it, then up at him, then up at... She didn't speak, but she extended her hand unhesitatingly, and when he took it, he asked, with a voice that didn't tremble, "Lucy, would you like me to be your father?" She nodded, her head resting on his chest, and for the first time, he felt the loss inside him settle into something steady, like roots reaching into firm soil. At night, alone in his small apartment, he reread Eleanor's final letter, the one he'd carried for years but never sent. "If something should happen, tell her I dreamed of her every night." He added a line beneath Eleanor's fading ink, writing to Lucy, "Your mother lived in this promise. Now I live in you." He closed the letter and laid it on his desk beside the drawing Lucy had given him the day before, of their two shadows, elongated by late sun, stretching ahead into a future neither of them yet understood, but both were beginning to walk into. After the official papers were signed, and Edward Miller silently assumed the title of Lucy's father, not in public ceremony, but in the quiet exchange of looks, offers of hot chocolate, and evenings spent repairing broken chairs in the orphanage workshop, his world shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated, not through grand gestures, but through the gentle rhythm of daily life, where grief faded not from our memory, but into meaning, born of hope and choice. Lucy began each day waiting by the window with a new drawing in her small hands, the pages folded and inked with forest greens, sky blues, and sunlight yellows. She drew Edward and herself in various scenes, a garden, a workshop, a kitchen, and though the lines were unsteady and the figures often mismatched, the truth in those pictures was unmistakable. They were a pair, walking forward together, building a story neither had known until they saw it reflected on paper. In the evenings, Edward cooked simple meals in the orphanage's communal kitchen, a pot roast with carrots, potatoes cooked just soft enough so that Lucy could smash them with a fork, and she would sit on a stool beside his worn boots, watching each movement, reporting every smell with bright eyes. "It smells like Sunday," she said once, and slowly learning the names of ingredients, the steady temper, of chopping and stirring, the way care tastes in quiet company. He began to notice in Lucy small signs of joy, the curl of her mouth when she found a new pencil, the way her hair fell into her eyes when she read a library book he had found in a donation box, the way she carried the locket close against her dress, as though it were a heartbeat against her chest, and he realized these remnants of war, these traces of a life without name, had become her identity's foundation, fragile but treasured, held safe in his presence. Weeks passed and Boston began to bloom again outside, trees budding along Columbia Road, cherry blossoms turning sidewalks pink in April, and within that seasonal renewal, Edward and Lucy crafted rituals that anchored them. Monday afternoons were for making paper kites near the Charles River, Tuesday mornings for borrowing books from the public library, Wednesday evenings for bread baking in the orphanage kitchen, and on Fridays, they would walk to the nearby Bunker Hill Monument, counting steps and holding hands, as though measuring how far they had come. Lucy never asked about London or Eleanor in words. Instead, she colored pictures of a white house on a hill with a garden behind it, or drew a woman standing by a window with long brown hair and gentle eyes. And after each drawing, she pressed it into Edward's coat pocket without a word, as if trusting him to understand without explanation. In one of those walks to the river, Edward found himself stopping beneath a blossoming magnolia and realizing he no longer feared the past as he had. Instead, he carried it in one hand with gratitude, holding it tenderly, while his other hand held Lucy's, guiding her toward all the things he couldn't fix, but the things he could build anew: trust, routine, the warmth of steady presence. There were nights, though, when the ghost of Eleanor's absence visited him. He would lie in bed after tucking Lucy into her cot, reading until late, and then feel hollow as though a part of him still floated between London and Boston, anchored to nothing. And on those nights, Lucy would sometimes stir in her sleep, whispering, "Papa," and reaching out into the dark until he put his fingers in her and she settled again, trusting the heartbeat that said, "I am here." In early autumn, with the orphanage windows open and the air carrying the smell of falling leaves, Edward decided to bring Lucy into the workshop one Saturday afternoon, showing her how to sand a small plank of pine, how to apply wood glue, how to clamp pieces together so that they fit snugly. Her small hands trembled at first, then steadied, and by the end of the afternoon she had made a little wooden bird, rough, simple, but hers, and she looked at him with eyes shining the same way Eleanor's had when she first held their unborn daughter in her arms. That evening, as she lay asleep beside the warmth of the cellar-heated night, Edward placed the wooden bird on her bedside table and wrote in a small notebook, "She is yours now. She belongs." And for perhaps the first time since the war ended, he felt a love so full it filled the hollow spaces grief had made. Boston changed in the months that followed. Shops reopened, orchestras returned to concert halls, children laughed in playgrounds rebuilt on bombed-out lots. And though Edward and Lucy's life together remained simple, it grew rich in stability. There were days she would run ahead of him on the sidewalk, twirling a kite, and he would watch her go pale pink around the cheeks, carefree, perfect in movement. And other days, he would sit beside her in the workshop, pressing his palm flat on her small fingers, teaching her how to plane wood in gentle strokes, his voice low and steady as he guided her. One crisp evening in early winter, under strings of electric lights that glowed in the orphanage courtyard, they stood together watching snowfall, beginning in earnest. First, fluttering flakes, then heavy clusters settling on coats and hats, and Lucy turned to Edward and said, without making it sound like a question, "You're my dad now." He nodded, feeling the words he had once feared were too fragile, spoken by someone who had found strength in him. He pulled her close, satisfied at last that he had found what he thought was gone forever. And in that embrace between a man who had lost everything and a child who had no past, something remarkable happened. War didn't overwrite hope, it expanded it. By the time spring circled around again, not with fanfare, but with the quiet reappearance of robins on telephone wires and the scent of lilacs curling through the morning air, Edward Miller had stopped measuring his life in losses and began, instead, to mark time by Lucy's footsteps echoing down the hallway, her laughter bouncing off the kitchen tiles, the small hand-painted calendar they kept in. The workshop with drawings for each new month, April showing a treehouse, May a wooden boat, June a garden full of bluebells that had never grown but always lived in their sketches. He officially adopted her on a rainy Tuesday, the courthouse nearly empty, the judge's voice low but warm, and Lucy sitting beside him in her best wool coat with a ribbon in her hair, clutching the wooden bird Edward had taught her to carve. Its wings slightly uneven, its body chipped in one corner but perfect in its imperfection because it was hers, made by her hands, guided by his. After the brief hearing, they walked home together through wet streets, umbrellas forgotten in the soft joy of the moment, Lucy skipping between puddles, Edward smiling without effort for the first time in years, and when they reached the workshop, he hung the adoption paper, neatly framed, beside the first drawing she had ever given him. The one with the house, the garden, and the man in uniform holding a child's hand. The war, Edward knew, had not truly ended in 1945. Not for him, not for Lucy. For people like them, the war's echoes lived in the silences, in the nights when the wind sounded like far-off sirens, in the empty chair at dinner, in the letter folded too many times to open without crumbling. But now, in this new life, those echoes no longer haunted. They became part of the music that scored their days, woven into something fuller, something truer than what had come before. He kept Eleanor's last letter in a wooden box in the corner of the workshop, not out of grief but out of reverence, And one day, when Lucy was older and ready, he would show it to her, let her trace the handwriting, feel the paper, understand the love her mother had carried even into the unknown. He had added a note to it months before, in pencil. "To the daughter you gave me without knowing. She saved me, Eleanor. She brought me home." They never spoke much about what came before, not because they were hiding from it, but because they had already made peace with the truth that not all families begin at birth, not all fathers are forged by blood, and not all love needs a beginning to be real. Some nights, Lucy would climb onto Edward's lap, her head resting against his chest as he read from old storybooks, and she would whisper, "Tell me again the story of when I found you." And he would smile every time and say, "It began with a word, and that word was Dad." We share stories like this every day, real tales that inspire and heal. If this one moved you, leave a comment. Because sometimes one word is enough to find your way home.